And next we have Steve Bourne with Atkins. I'll let him say a little bit about himself.
Hi, I'm Steve. I am also based in the Atlanta area. My focus at Atkins is on resilience modeling. And the tool you'll be hearing about today that I'll describe is City Simulator. I'm the lead developer of that.
Great. Thank you both for being here today. With that, I will turn it back over to Abby to begin telling you a little bit about ARC's data-driven transportation planning process.
Thank you so much. And if we, okay, there we go. All right, so as Steve mentioned, we're going to talk about the City Simulator tool. It's a GIS extension that focuses a lot on resiliency. And so we've been working over the past about 18 months to do a local implementation of that tool for the ARC. So Steve is going to review the details of the tool and some of the outputs that we got. And then I'm going to talk about how we're actually taking that work and actually using it in our planning process for our RTP and our TIP individual project review level implementation. And then just a brief note at the end about some of our experiences and how we think this can transfer to other regions, how other regions use this tool or something similar to it in order to implement a more data-driven planning process. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it back over so that Steve can do the review of City Simulator first.
Okay, Steve, you should have controls now. Let's see.
Okay, I think I have control. All right. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm lead developer of City Simulator. This chart, this slide you're seeing here is the requirements for City Simulator. I like to kind of present these because they give you a very good idea of like what it is and how we went about developing it. When we thought about resilience modeling, which is what City Simulator does, we thought, you know, okay, let's write down the high level requirements for a tool like this. We thought capture interacting systems. We at Atkins, we have a long heritage of flood modeling, so we kind of lean towards that, but we said, let's break out of that. Let's sort of knock down some silos here, and let's create a model that simulates the economy and the people and infrastructure and natural systems all interacting with each other to understand, you know, if you do get floods in the future from climate change, what impacts do they actually have on the economy and on people and things like that. We said, let's make the tool include business as usual as well as disasters in the analysis. You know, there's a high correlation between the sort of prosperity or productivity of communities that are prepared for disasters at business as usual times. You know, if you're prepared for disasters, it sort of means you're thinking about how prepared your community is, which usually makes you more successful in general. Let's include disasters that are representative of climate change. So obviously we want to have that being part and parcel of the analysis. Let's allow for addition of proposed strategies. So in a planning context, you know, you want to be able to try out new things. You know, if you're a coastal community and you want to add a seawall to protect you from rising seas, you want to be able to try that in this tool, even though it doesn't exist, to see how effective it's going to be, how much more resilient it's going to make you. And then let's include a long enough timeline to measure return on investment. You'll see as I present the analyses, we analyzed from 2020 to 2050. Typically, you know, we're trying to look at the lifespan of assets that we're installing to increase resiliency. So we want a long, decades-long time frame. And then finally, let's make it so that you can use this tool to conduct your analysis in a planning context. In other words, it doesn't need to be years and years of analysis. It doesn't need to be millions of dollars. Let's make it so that, you can get the work done in a year, and you don't have to, you can spend like a planning level budget to do it. And so what we came up with was this sort of scenario-based resiliency modeling approach, where we build a digital twin of the community, and that goes into great detail. I'll get into that in a second. And then we create a climate change influenced weather, and if you're on the coast, tide forecasts. And then we sort of simulate, using those forecasts, the community, the digital twin evolving over time. So new buildings are being built, new construction is happening, new infrastructure is being added, population's growing, economy's growing, all of that. And let's measure over the course of that simulation. Obviously large storms may occur, heat waves, droughts, and so on. Let's measure how vulnerable the community is, or the other side of that coin is how resilient the community is. And then let's, be able to create another scenario where we add adaptation and mitigation measures, like the seawall I mentioned, and go ahead and run the scenario again and measure exactly the same metrics and work out, has this made the community much more resilient? And by doing this, what we're able to do is quantify how much more resilient through a list of metrics. And some of them are listed here, stuff like storm damage to buildings, economic productivity, tax revenue, population growth, land development, commutes disrupted. There's a lot of different metrics you can measure with the tool. The digital twin I mentioned, this is a GIS-based tool. City Simulator is an Esri ArcMap extension. And so we have a lot of data that's GIS-based within the tool to build this digital twin. This is how we like to consider it. There's system infrastructure. So this is, the standard GIS layers, parcels, building stock, roads, stormwater, and so on. And then on top of that, we have system users. The tool is, the model is agent-based. So, if you have a town of 100,000 people, we have 100,000 avatars in this digital twin moving around, going to work, going to school, and so on. And this is how we measure disruption for future climate change. And then we have system control down the bottom there. You have controls on what can be built, where it can be built, zoning, political boundaries and policies, building codes, and so on. Those are also within the tool, so that when new development occurs, it's actually controlled. And when you create adaptation scenarios, you can actually change policies and see what impact they have in the future. I'm going to show you an example here. This is actually an example of a completed study we did for Boulder County, and I have a few slides on that just to kind of give you the idea of how the tool works. Later on, we'll actually go into how it was applied in Atlanta. Boulder County commissioned this study. It was from a FEMA CDBG grant, and they commissioned a resiliency study, their Department of Transportation. They were after understanding, what are future impacts to building stock and transportation infrastructure due to climate change. If I zoom in here, you start to see some of the digital twin part of the tool. Here we actually have parcels, we have building footprints, we have the floodplains. These are the FEMA floodplains, so an existing flood study that we were able to use to estimate flooding in buildings. If I zoom in even further, you can see I've gone into the floodplain here and I've selected a specific building. This is a commercial building, people are working there. As I mentioned, the tool is agent-based, and so what we have to do is we take census block group data, and that's like number of jobs, number of households, number of population, and we distribute that to each building so that the statistics in the census block groups match up with our model. And so we then have an agent-based community full of people that we can start to analyze with. Going back to that building that I had selected, you can see that the model thinks that this is the number of people who are working in this building. It also has their commute path, so it understands they work there and they live somewhere else. And so these are the indexes of the different streets that they take to get to work every day. And because we have that for every building in the county, what we can do is say, all right, pick a building and show me the commute footprint of that building. So you can see the selected part of the transportation system here in cyan. It is, you know, if any part of this transportation system gets flooded due to, you know, some flood that occurs, we know that that has an impact on the people being able to get to work to that building. And so you can see, you know, we start to get an understanding of, you know, what the people impacts are and economic impacts are of future floods. Flood modeling, you know, that's an expensive process. And as I mentioned, you know, one of our requirements was, let's not make this cost, you know, millions of dollars to do this. We don't want to recreate flood models if we already have them. And so what we do, you know, from the FEMA flood study that's already existing, there are depth rasters, you know, like for certain sizes of flood, 25-year, 10-year, 50-year, and so on. There's a raster here. So we can just say, what is the depth of flooding at this building? And we can get a curve that says, it's a response curve that says, you know, if you get a 100-year flood in the future, this is the amount of flooding that will occur in this building. And so we can start to use that information to get damage estimates and, you know, understand whether that building can be operating during floods that we're simulating. The end result is that for every building, we end up with a flood response curve. So, you know, if a storm of 7.42 inches happens, we get 2 feet of flooding in this particular building. We also have over here, this is a depth damage curve. So that says if 2 feet of flooding occurs, the cost to repair it is about 13% of the replacement cost of the building. We have that, again, for every building in the community. And so when we simulate a flood, we can get a dollar value of how much damage is actually occurring. We also considered transportation in this analysis. And so, you know, the transportation system, we have a full travel model that's simulating all the agents going from home to work and back every day. We look at culverts and bridges and where they get overtopped by flooding, we keep track of that. So for every culvert and every bridge, I think there are about 200 of them in this community. We had a curve like this that said, all right, if a storm happens, this is the depth of overtopping. If that depth gets really big, you know, it usually results in sort of the bridge washing out or the culvert washing out, and the road associated with it becomes unusable. And so that has a massive impact on, you know, productivity, people being able to get to work, and so on. Here's an example of a piece of infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. Here, that's its overtopping curve. And so, you know, here's a simple example here where it says we get a storm of 5.5 inches. That results in 3.3 feet of overtopping for this particular culvert, which results in a 30-day recovery period. In other words, it takes them 30 days to set something up so that people can start to use that road again. And it costs $1.6 million in damage as a result of that storm. Something new we added to this analysis for Boulder was pluvial flooding. The dark area here that you're seeing on the figure is the FEMA floodplain, but you can see that there are blue areas and red areas as well that are outside the floodplain. That's pluvial flooding. That's the kind of flooding that just happens as rain is hitting, you know, your property. The rain doesn't go to the river and then river overtops and then floods your property. It's more of a direct impact. And as you can see, there's a lot of it happening in this county. So we included this as well as the riverine flooding, so we got an idea of, you know, flooding happening outside the floodplain, which is a real factor and a real risk. When City Simulator does simulation, it works this way. This is what we call our nested loop diagram. The outer loop is urbanization, and the inner loop is disasters, commerce, you know, things that happen on a daily basis. The outer loop happens just once a year, and the way it works is it forecasts the economy for the next year, and translates that into commercial infrastructure, which it places across the landscape in vacant lots that are, ready and zoned accordingly. And then it works out how many new businesses are added to those buildings, and then how many workers are in each business, and adds the agents accordingly. It'll then add new housing for the agents, add families to that housing, match up the children to going to schools and so on. And then it'll add new infrastructure to kind of connect all these new buildings together. And then it'll assess, impacts like adjustments to floodplains, ecosystem impacts, and carbon footprint impacts. The inner loop focuses on disasters. So it first asks the question every day, did a disaster occur today? If it did, it says, which buildings were affected by it, and works out how long it's going to take for those buildings to recover. It also simulates people going to work and commerce happening in the city. How does it incorporate climate change? As I mentioned, we have these sort of driving forecasts of rain and temperature and tide and things like that. Those are derived from global climate models, which use scenarios about how greenhouse gas will be controlled in the future to work out future temperatures and rainfall. It's all set up by the UN IPCC, and it's really kind of the state of the art of how you forecast climate change and project weather in the future. There's a lot of different models, and there's many different scenarios of how greenhouse gas will be controlled. So what we tend to do is to use all of them in sort of an ensemble forecast. And we generate, 500 to 1,000 different versions of the future. And then we'll run all of them through our model. And then we get, not just the sort of median expected value of different metrics, but we get error bars around them, so we get worst case and best case. This is an example of rainfall for Boulder. How does all that look when we start the run? Here's a video that shows the 100-year event for Boulder. This is just one event. Normally, we would run 30 years of this to get, a multi-decadal run that will include lots of different storms. But you can see this storm hits, and all those dots that showed up, those are houses that were flooded, and the red squares here are culverts and bridges that have been flooded and are recovering. Over here, you can see that, because of this event, the green line dropped and rose back up again. The green line is the engaged workforce, or people who can get to work. And so you can see that storm had a big impact on what happened in Boulder. In our simulation for Boulder, we focused on these metrics. They were building stock impacts, transportation impacts like disrupted trips. We were able to break that out into what they were disrupted by. Was a person's workplace flooded, home flooded, or roadway or pathway from one to the other flooded, and economic impacts as well, like lost production. We found that these whiskered plots here are sort of a range of values that we get, and they're based on the range of severity of the forecasts of rainfall for the coming 3 decades. So you can see the 100th percentile is the top number here, and the 0th percentile is the yellow squares. And so we end up using something more like the 75th percentile number, which is the top of these red bars, as our main scenario to do analysis with. You really want to look at kind of the worst case or something close to the worst case, so that you can know that you're prepared for future events. Some of the results we found, here's the SFHA. This is sort of the floodplain, and the 500-year fringe is sort of the section of floodplain, that is less likely to be flooded, but in the future might be flooded because storms are getting larger. And then the outside of the 500-year, so this is the area that's presumed to be at low risk, but we found through our pluvial flooding that maybe that's not true. You can see that existing buildings, out of the 1,642 in the SFHA, the floodplain, 900 of them are damaged in our 30-year run. at an average loss of $185,000 per building. So, you know, it's pretty substantial. One other thing to notice here is that outside of the 500-year floodplain, 161 buildings are damaged, and that's because of the pluvial flooding that I mentioned. Vulnerabilities in the transportation system, we also saw those. So, you know, this is the number of trips disrupted over one of our runs. And, you know, you can see there's 2 major storm events that occur. The bars are colored according to the reason that the trip was disrupted. So green bars here are trips that are disrupted due to roads flooding, people's commutes being blocked. And so you can see it dominates over workplaces being flooded and homes being flooded. And so this told the Department of Transportation in Boulder, we really need to work on our infrastructure to make sure that we can reduce this disruption in the future. The end result, we also use remoteness within this analysis. So, you know, people living out here in the mountains in Boulder, they usually only have one path to get to work. So if, you know, a storm happens and that path gets blocked, they're basically not able to work that day. And so, you know, we needed to be able to differentiate those folks from folks in the urban center, which had lots of different paths and were less disrupted as a result of storm damage. The end result of all this was that, you know, we were able to actually rank every culvert and every bridge in the county in terms of how disruptive it's going to be in the future. And the top ranked ones are over here. This is sort of our top 10 worst performing. Boulder County was able to actually take this result, put it into a grant application to design new infrastructure, and they received funding from FEMA to do that. And so they're focusing on 3 of these bridges, the top 3 offenders, right now, building new designs for them, and they'll be able to construct that within the next couple of years. Some other results that came out of this tool, one of the scenarios we tried was to improve the transportation infrastructure. And some of the things we varied were, you know, what if you apply all of your improvements in the first year? What if you apply them annually? So in a couple of bridges a year, a couple of culverts a year, or what if you only respond after disasters occur? And you can see that there's a massive difference here in terms of, you know, if you're prepared, if you're continually and actively working on it, you can get a huge reduction in disrupted trips. So this is about 4 times more reduction than only acting after disasters. So that was a very important conclusion. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Atlanta implementation. Abby, did you want to introduce this?
Yeah, so back in 2018, we applied for an FHWA grant about resilience and durability to extreme weather in particular. And so we reviewed a bunch of tools. City Simulator seemed like exactly the right tool for this pilot project. So we selected Atkins to work with us. And the main goals of the project, you can see listed there, were to actively integrate resilience and durability into the agency. So it was very much a focus on avoiding things like lip service or kind of a, you know, create a plan and put it on the shelf and then don't actually use the results of it. And they focused very heavily on data analytics and finding a tool like City Simulator that could highlight where you were vulnerable. Specifically in the transportation system, it was kind of a bonus that we also got the land use and buildings information from City Simulator. And they wanted it to develop a tool now so that you can see what your end goal needs to be and then be able to implement the results from your study so that you can monitor performance over time and make sure that your area is actually getting to that end result, where you can, you know, say most of our infrastructure is resilient, or, you know, the most important lifelines in the city are going to be okay if a major storm hits or something like that. So we've been working on this since 2018, and we actually submitted our final report to FHWA in September. So we are not done with the project yet. We've got our report on the pilot project that we developed, and they haven't signed off on it yet. So we are definitely still in the midst of the project. It's ongoing, but it's been amazing. And Steve will show you some of the Atlanta specific results that we've gotten.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. So what we did, there were a few things we did within the project. One was to provide a high-level screening tool that looks at accessibility for people throughout the Atlanta region to essential services, education, and jobs. That was sort of our, screening level process, regional process. And I think Abby has some slides on that in a few slides. We also provided training on using the high detail city simulator model with a Google Classroom. You can see a screenshot of it over here. This is actually like a full, it's got 5 sections. It has within each section instruction and walkthroughs on how to build a city simulator model. And those include video walkthroughs. So, they're all up on YouTube. And, we go into pretty good detail there showing, where you get the data, how you import it into the tool, how you run the tool, and so on. There is a pilot area that we focused on within the central Atlanta area within that training. And I'm going to have a few slides on that in the next slides. The goal really is to work with the Atlanta region stakeholders, counties and cities, to build similar models across the region. So this is our pilot area. The northwest portion of this area is I-85, 75, 85, and I-20, if you're familiar with Atlanta, sort of the center of the city. And what you can see on here is you can see all the different buildings that are within this area. There's 12,000 buildings. Within those, there's 72,000 agents that live within the area, 29,000 households, 40,000 jobs, and $6.7 billion in real estate value. Some of the major transportation corridors, of course, there's I-75, 85, and I-20, but there's also like Moreland Avenue and Boulevard and those kind of streets, which are major arterials. The shape of the pilot area is dictated by the fact that it's based on a watershed, Entrenchment Creek watershed, which flows down here from north to south to the South River. The pilot area for flood modeling, I wanted to kind of highlight how we did flood modeling here. We used the FEMA National Flood Hazard Layer models, similar to what we did with Boulder, to get riverine flooding. And the red dots you see on the map here, these are at-risk buildings in that riverine flooding area. We also used pluvial modeling, which I mentioned in Boulder. And I think I have a sort of an illustration of that. This is it. So you can see that, basically dark blue areas are deep pluvial flooding. And so I've zoomed in here to a particular area within the watershed, and you can see road flooding here. There's a lot of that. Some buildings being flooded as well. This sort of illustrates very clearly that, just using the riverine flooding isn't enough. You have to go to the pluvial flooding as well to really capture the flood risk. Here's an example of this particular pilot area running. And so you can see that we get, the blue dots here are road flooding and the black dots are building flooding. And so you can see over this forecast, we do get quite a bit of flooding. Down at the bottom of the dashboard here, the upper lines, they show growth of population, households, and so on. And the bars here show the purple part is the productivity lost due to flooding, and the green part is the storm damage due to flooding. As a result of all that analysis, what we were able to do, just like Boulder, we were able to find, sort of stormwater hotspots, and, show that, this large dot right here is 15,000 trips per year are disrupted because of flooding. One thing to note here is that, we also included the pluvial flooding but we didn't include the stormwater control of that pluvial flooding. That typically requires data from a local stakeholder. In this case, it was the City of Atlanta, and the City of Atlanta was reluctant to share that stormwater data. So we might be overestimating flooding in a lot of areas here because they do have a stormwater control system. We also looked at heat impacts. Here's a forecast just for the general area, how maximum temperature will increase over the next out to 2100 actually. So you can see fairly substantial increases of about 10 degrees Fahrenheit in maximum temperature from the start to the finish here. How does that actually impact the city? We looked at things like mode choice. So we model, everyone going to work. We actually model, what their choice is. Do they take single occupant vehicle, transit, walk? And so we're able to actually work out, which part of their trip is walking and how much heat exposure will they receive over that walk. Well, we're also able to work out, how long they spend at a bus stop, for example. And so we can work out how much heat exposure each path results in. Here's an example. This is like we've picked one agent who lives in a house up here, and we've said, show us the paths, auto, transit, and walk. And so the green one is the auto, I think. The the red one here, that's walking to a bus stop and then taking transit. And I think the blue one is just straight walking, or it might be the other way around. But basically, for every agent in the pilot area here, we have these three choices of paths, and we can work out, as they walk along these streets, how much heat exposure are they receiving. We also had tree canopy for Atlanta, so we could work out how much shade are they, how much shade is present during that walk, and calculate the value of the tree canopy as a result. Applying that and kind of rolling it up to the whole pilot area, what we were able to work out was the change in people choosing auto versus transit and walk as it gets hotter into the future. So here's a maximum temperature forecast from one of our models. And you can see that the blue bars get higher and higher over time. And that's because people are, according to our model, are choosing to go in air-conditioned vehicles, even though that means more air-conditioned vehicles on the roads over time. And so, clearly the adaptation and mitigation measures here need to be things like increasing tree canopy, air conditioning, bus stops, and things like that to, make sure it's, to make sure that this trend doesn't actually occur. We also looked at pilot area heat impact on rail. Above about 108 degrees Fahrenheit, rails start to buckle. And so this has an impact both on commuter rail and freight rail because the trains have to slow down. They can't really work. When the rails start to buckle, they have to reduce their speed quite substantially, which reduces the number of people able to travel, the amount of freight that can be processed, and so on. Okay, I think that's it for me. Abby, did you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And if you want to go ahead and switch it over to my control, I will start walking through the presentation. So the conclusions of building out this model are that it does take a lot of data. City Simulator is designed to work with open source data. So you don't necessarily have to go out and buy a lot of large data sets to use it, but you do need to be data savvy and know the data that you're getting and make sure that you've got the right years and that it's cleaned up. And that effort alone can be a little bit daunting. And that does take a fair amount of our time to make sure that we have all the data we need over the entire area that we're studying. That was a challenge. And then the other one was getting staff trained. So I am absolutely blown away by the Google Classroom. It is a fantastic resource because it really does walk you down. I mean, even from just like, here's how you download the model, like from the beginning and then all the way through a complete run. And it is a great resource for us when we want to train either existing staff or if we bring in a new person, they can become fully fluent in the tool, in the city simulator model, and actually help us achieve some of the goals that we're setting out to achieve. And I think that's one of the biggest hurdles, especially when you're talking about some really data heavy or high tech stuff, is if you get someone, especially fresh out of planning school, who is an excellent planner, it's that the data piece that might be missing, and being able to, run a pretty heavy duty model, they might not have experience in that. And so having a great tool like the Google Classroom built for us, we can bridge the gap between what they know now and then what we actually need to know in the future to do scenario planning. So those are definitely the biggest challenges that we face: data and staff training. But if you are prepared, it's really a great tool to use. One of the other things that we did specifically for the entire region, so this is the 20 county region that ARC covers, we did a lot of these accessibility maps, and we did them for auto and transit. And you can see this one is specific to hospitals. So this is access by automobile for different households trying to get to local area hospitals. And you can see the blue areas are good. There's a lot of redundant pathways to get from a house to a hospital, that kind of stuff. As it gets more into the red, those areas and the people who live there are going to face the most risk of being cut off from that access. So we did this for hospitals, schools, commercial districts, a bunch of different aspects of just living and being in the region here. And we did them on the left-hand side from meeting demand all the way to not meeting demand. And then we pulled out the worst case scenarios on the right-hand side. So these are the ones where we absolutely need some kind of intervention here to provide whatever the service is in these areas. So in this case, these are the areas that are really going to face a challenge. If a single road is flooded, they might not be able to get to a hospital, right? And so we did this for the entire region for a bunch of different factors. And that was a really important tool that you'll see how we use this in project scoring in just a second. So I'm going to talk to you about what we call the KDP2 process. Our regional plan development and our TIP project selection development, we built a few years ago what we call the Key Decision Point Framework, or KDP. And so basically we get the whole world of projects that people want to add to the plan in our area. And then we go through a set of 3 different KDP filters. So the first one is a policy filter. And that one's pretty straightforward. Most projects will pass the policy filter. And that's just making sure that, we're not building like an 18-lane highway or something like that. So just the most basic things that we want to make sure don't get brought into the region. KDP2 is individual level project evaluation. So this is where we look at every single project individually and see how it performs across a range of metrics. And this takes a lot of data, it takes a lot of staff time. It really is a super intensive process, especially because we can get hundreds of projects that come through the TIP call, and we evaluate each one individually. And we evaluate it for things like its design, and we also evaluate it for how it performs in the system as a whole. And then after we get scores from KDP2, we go into KDP3 for final factors. And those are just where we take a step back from data, and we actually look at each project, and we basically use our best guess as planners, right? Our best educated guess to say which projects are really going to make a difference, which ones we actually think are good projects from a planning perspective. And then of course, all of that data gets rolled into the funding decisions. And we look at how much money we have from different sources and how they can be applied and which projects we can actually fund based on the scores and the cost benefit analysis. It's that KDP2 section where we want to implement the results of this FHWA grant. So we want to really beef up the resilience and the durability data evaluation that we've got now and add it into the existing framework. We do have this is our current set of metrics and how they're weighted against each other for different project types. So across the top, you see like bike ped and trail projects, roadway asset management projects, and on and on. And then down the side, these are all the different metrics that we judge them for. And each project type is judged differently for all the different criteria. So safety is going to be bike ped and trails specific safety measures, roadway asset management specific safety measures. And then they're weighted according to the percents that you see here to get their final score. And we do have a placeholder there for resiliency, but we made a special note in saying that we were working on this starting in 2018, and that the actual resiliency measures were going to be developed in 2020. So that's why you have a lot of blanks in that category. The same is true for reliability. That was another one that we were developing metrics separately. So we implemented this framework a couple of years ago, knowing that we were going to tweak it over a several year period as we got more and more results from these studies. So that brings us back to this accessibility map. This is one of the first things that we did for the FHWA project. And we're focused on this, trying to decide what metric we actually want to create. And this is where you kind of get to see how the sausage is made. We don't actually know yet. We're still in that decision-making process of how are we going to implement these results into that project level evaluation. Right now we've kind of narrowed it down to two options. The first one is simply based on geography. So is the project that we are trying to evaluate located in one of those hotspot areas? So on the map on the right here, is it located in one of the red areas? If it is, it's probably going to help. That's kind of the assumption that we have to make. If you're, widening a road or something like that, it might help accessibility. It's not guaranteed to help. It definitely could hinder. But our option here is kind of a yes or no score. So is it located in the hotspot area? Yes. And then the staff will take a look at all of those that are located in the hotspot area and try to determine, do we think, based on our best judgment, this will help resiliency or help accessibility for the people who live in this area, or do we think it's going to hinder it? This is definitely the easier option. It's pretty easy to just, take that map and then map on it a bunch of projects and spit out a yes, no, is it located in the area or not? It's a really quick exercise in GIS software. And the review of that, because we're going to be reviewing each project anyway, it just goes into that set of review before we score it. Option two is much more intense. The idea here would be that we would run, essentially, we would make a city simulator run based on every single project. So we would score it based on the actual design and how well it performs on all of the different testing options that Steve outlined earlier. So is this, going to reduce the amount of overtopping? Is it going to reduce the amount of time it takes to recover from a specific event? Is it going to reduce the cost and the productivity that's lost and that kind of stuff? And the scoring option here would be very much based on that outcome. So you can gain points if you're helping. You could potentially lose points if you are hindering, if your results come back really poorly. So this option is much, much more precise, but it does take a lot more effort. We would have to basically make a run for every project, or maybe a package of projects that kind of relate to each other. And again, going back to the data and the staff training, that might be a lot for a single person to undertake. This would be ideal. We would love to be able to have this much data on every project that we score. It just comes down to a logistics. Can we actually make all of these runs in addition to doing all of the other metrics that we want to do for every project? So we haven't really decided. We think right now we're probably going to implement something like option one until we we get more staff trained and we get more resources, and we make sure that we can develop out the entire 20 county region so that we can make those individual runs really quickly and easily and really implement using City Simulator and its outputs into our planning process. We'll let you know, all of this is available on our website, all of our framework and the information and how we score projects, all of that is publicly available. So we are definitely going to update what we call the TIP cookbook. It's basically our scoring guide, how we rank all of these projects. We are constantly updating that. And as soon as we get this metric in particular picked out, it will go into the cookbook. Which brings me to transferability to other regions. Everything here is publicly available. And as you saw, City Simulator has been built in Colorado. It's been built here in Atlanta. It really is designed to work anywhere that you have the data coverage to feed the results. So it's meant to be used with open source data. So everything, floodplains and stuff like that are available from FEMA. A lot of things like building footprints and street map and stuff like that is all publicly available. You can scrape it from, OpenStreetMap or Google or something like that. So it's designed to basically be implemented anywhere. So we are in the process now of getting the results back from our report, which details exactly what we went through to implement it in the Atlanta region, and the challenges that we faced and advice that we would give to other regions. So as soon as we get that back from FHWA, that's going to go up on our website as well. So all of that will be available for other regions who are interested in using either this platform or our KDP2 process. So that was a ton of information that we just fed to you. So if there are any questions, we'd be happy to take them now, or you can always email either of us for any of the information that you've seen here today. And Crystal, I'm going to give this control back to you.
Thank you. All right, so we have about 10 minutes or so for some Q&A. I'm gonna scroll back to the contact information in case you guys want that. Do we have any questions? Okay, I'll keep an eye out from the audience here to see if anybody has any questions. I wanted to ask Steve and Abby, you include progress and development in the model of CitySim. Would something like the impact of COVID-19 have any bearing on what that model looks like, or is it just kind of a fixed assumption at this point?
Yeah, I can speak to that. We actually added an epidemic module within City Simulator as COVID-19 was, starting up in March and April timeframe. So we can, it's already agent-based. So we already had, contact modeling going on within the tool because people go to work and work together. And so what we had to add on top of that was, an infection module so that, we can start an infection somewhere and see how it spreads. And then we can try things like social distancing and those types of measures to see how effective they would be. So that's actually already in the tool. And epidemic is one of the disaster types you can add to your simulation if you want to do that. So it definitely, and as people get sick, the tool simulates them staying at home and then going to hospitals and things like that. What we were after, because we were, as I mentioned, our heritage is kind of flood and emergency response. What we were after was simulating what happens if there's an epidemic and a hurricane at the same time. Are your shelters going to be enough if you have to socially distance people within the shelters? So we were after answering questions like that. There's some literature about that on the City Simulator website, and I'd welcome you to go ahead and take a look at that.
That's great. Good to know. I know, Abby, you mentioned there were some additional kind of side benefits outside of the transportation planning focus on roads and flooding and heat. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those additional, I guess, features or benefits that you guys discovered and how they might be used elsewhere in the ARC agency?
Yeah, so the grant was really focused on transportation assets and transportation infrastructure, which is obviously very important, but City Simulator allowed us to also look at buildings, and which was a huge bonus, and to get economic information out of it in addition to those traditional transportation metrics. So usually in transportation, we're looking at things like mode, and are people driving or walking and that kind of stuff. And if a road is blocked, do they have a redundant path to get to where they need to go, and that kind of stuff. We don't tend to study the economic side of a lot of this stuff. Usually it's just, downtime, things like that. So to be able to get economic information out of it, it's just another facet of the argument that we can present to policymakers and stakeholders when we're trying to, convince them to build durable and resilient infrastructure, and convince them that, climate change is definitely something that we need to take into consideration now, because we know things are going to trend worse in the future. And the chart that Steve showed earlier, where, the amount that you can stave off by taking action now is much, much greater than waiting to see something terrible happen and then take action. So it made a multifaceted argument for us, a good platform that we can stand on and point to a bunch of different aspects to say that, yes, this one bridge will have a lot of different benefits. It'll get people to hospitals faster, but it will also keep businesses running and economics, productivity flowing through the region. So it's definitely helpful to be able to have all of those different angles. Mm-hmm.
Great. And kind of a follow-up question to that, do you see, we talked about transferability to other regions and cities. Is there transferability of this tool to other types of groups that maybe might not be focused on transportation?
Yeah, I'd let Steve answer that, but I definitely think so. Transportation is just one element of the GIS that we're adding to the model. So Steve, if you want to give a little bit more detail, I do definitely think it impacts a lot more than just transportation.
Yeah, transportation was the focus of the two studies we presented today, but the tool was definitely not, created to only look at transportation issues. It's, within it, there are, 3 or 4 different major models interacting with each other, one of which is a travel model, but there's also a building stock model. And, there's also models that relate to people, equity, looking at, are people disadvantaged that are in low to middle income categories. There's also models related to different disaster types. So for example, wildfire out west, we have a model that looks at aridity and can forecast fires occurring to some degree and the follow-on impacts that flooding has if it happens in an area that has undergone a fire recently. So there's a lot of different models, and really the goal was to kind of knock down the silos and the analytical silos, and kind of bring all the science together so that you get a more representative simulation of a community than you normally would if you're just focused on flood or just focused on transportation or what have you.
Great. And since this is a summit on sustainability, and I know we've talked about the resiliency and trying to build that in, and recognizing that it will cost less money to address an issue today than it would to fix it in the future as a result of extreme weather events. I know you mentioned the heat, the temperature change over the decades. So it seems like, are there models within there that look at like urban heat island effect or tree canopy changes?
Yeah, yeah. So as I mentioned, the commute, travel time and heat exposure issues, we have in there a model of tree canopy, and we literally have the path people are taking from their home to the bus stop. So we can work out along that path how much tree canopy is in effect, and how much is it reducing the heat exposure as they make their walk. So we're right down at that level of detail. So what you can do is, put in an adaptation measure like increase the tree canopy, tree planting, and measure how much of an impact that would have on metrics like heat exposure and, other metrics that are related to high heat. It doesn't have to be people's commutes. It can be, amount of air conditioning used, amount of electricity, carbon footprint, and that kind of stuff. That all relates to, how many trees are in the area.
Good to know. All right, we have a couple more minutes. I'm keeping an eye on the chat box to see if anybody wants to toss in a question. But I'll throw one more out there myself. And that is, we talked about the challenges with having the appropriate amount of data and the coverage. But I'm wondering, say that you have a good amount of data, and you know where it is and you have it collected. For a city or county, how long would it take to actually build this model and run this model for themselves?
You can have a running model working very quickly, 6 weeks, that kind of thing. It's one of those things where the more data you put into it, the better your results become, so it's more of a process of you get sort of first draft model going, which can take, just a matter of weeks. And then you find out which data you should add to improve it, and go search for that data and bring that data in. So it's sort of that kind of process. And of course, it depends on the size of the area that you're working on. Typically, the model works well up to about 500,000 person area. And then after that, it starts to bog down, traditional laptops and workstations. So what we do is we say, if you have an area bigger than that, build multiple models, and then you can stitch them together at the borders through the transportation corridors. And that works fairly well. And that means that, you can basically model those areas somewhat independently, and then do the stitching together as a post process. So you can get to, multi-million person areas, but that obviously takes more time. Really, it was designed to be a sort of a mid-sized city kind of tool. So it works well there. It works very well for smaller communities, but the larger communities, you do have to do a little bit of extra work.
Thank you. Well, we are at time. Abby, Steve, do you have any closing thoughts or anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, I have really loved working on this project, and we are nowhere near done. So all of the stuff that we're developing now will be up on the Atlanta Regional Commission website. So if you're at all interested, please take a look. We are very, very, very happy to share it.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say that, the story's not over. We're now talking with Gwinnett County, which is the third largest by population, I think, in the region. And they're interested in applying the tool as well. And that's sort of like how we envisioned it, was that it wouldn't be all the Atlanta Regional Commission doing the modeling. It would be a collaborative effort between ARC and the different communities out there. So we're excited that that's something that we're looking into and might get started up fairly soon.
That's exciting to hear. And thank you, Abby and Steve, for sharing the CitySim process with us today and the insights into how we're using it at ARC. And thank you to the participants who have sat in on this with us today. We hope you found it valuable, and please feel free to reach out to Steve and Abby in the future with any questions you may have. Thank you all. And I will direct you back, sorry, putting back on my host hat here, direct you to the closing plenary, which starts at 11:30. If you want to navigate your way back to www.morpc.org/summitlive. There you'll find the closing plenary, which includes a couple of additional sustainability awards that MORPC is presenting, as well as the closing keynote. Dr. Catherine Hayhoe is going to talk about climate disruption and how we can live and survive and thrive with it. So, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.